Knockouts. We see them all the time.
People getting slapped, punched, kicked, hitting heads, hit by balls, other objects. We see it in shows, in sports, games, movies. That leaves people seeing stars out cold.
But what is a knockout? And what really happens when someone gets knocked out? Well, let's find out.
Getting knocked out is a severe form of a concussion. The term concussion comes from the Latin concussio, meaning to strike together or shake violently, which gives us a clue of what happens to the brain during a head strike. When someone is hit in the head, a force is applied from the striking object to the person's skull and to its inner contents. This includes the membranes and the fluids surrounding the brain and the brain itself. The membrane structures are known as the meninges, which are made up of the dura, arachnoid, and pia. The space under the arachnoid is called the subarachnoid space, and this is home to the special fluid the brain sits or rarely floats in, called cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF for short. Now let's take a punch for example. When a person is hit in the face, the force is translated from the fist into the skull. Suspended in CSF, the brain is vulnerable to sudden bodily movements. An injury to the brain at the point of impact is called a coup injury. Because the brain is floating around in that CSF, it can move around or shake violently within the skull and strike against the side of the skull opposite to the blow. This second brain injury is called the contre-coup.
This trauma can lead to a malfunctioning of the brain, which can result in a concussion. A concussion can be described as a reversible clinical syndrome manifested by signs and symptoms that affect physical, cognitive, emotional, and sleep domains.
But what actually happens to the brain during a knockout? Let's take a closer look. A concussion is followed by a complex cascade of ionic, metabolic, and physiologic events at a cellular and brain network level, which ultimately lead to the symptoms experienced during a concussion. Immediately following impact to the brain, biomechanical forces such as shearing and stretching forces cause a temporary dysregulation in the cell membranes, causing an outflow of intracellular potassium and subsequent diffuse neuronal activation known as depolarization. This massive excitation is then followed by a wave of relative neuronal suppression that has been termed spreading depression. Early loss of consciousness, amnesia, or other cognitive dysfunction may be manifestations of a post-traumatic spreading depression-like state. Depolarization promotes the release of excitatory chemicals known as neurotransmitters, which are involved in cortical activation and hyperexcitability, which can lead to cell damage and injury. In an effort to restore normal balance, energy-requiring membrane pumps within the cells of the brain are activated and trigger an increase in the use of the fuel source glucose, which is used by mitochondria to produce energy. However, these excitatory neurotransmitters can cause an influx and accumulation of intracellular calcium through special receptors known as NMDA receptors. This increase of calcium in the cell can lead to mitochondrial dysfunction and oxidative stress, ultimately resulting in a decreased energy production and hypometabolic state. This energy crisis means it's harder for the brain to heal itself and return to normal homeostasis and functioning. Imaging by PET scans has shown this decrease in global cerebral glucose metabolism may last up to 2 to 4 weeks post-brain injury, thus potentiating the effects of concussion. This impairment of mitochondrial function and reduced energy production also provides a further stimulus for increased glucose fuel source use, ultimately leading to an increased lactic acid accumulation. Elevated lactate levels can result in further neuronal dysfunction by causing an acidic environment, membrane damage, and altering the blood-brain barrier, It can also cause cerebral edema or swelling. Other effects include reduction in the levels of magnesium. Intracellular magnesium levels are also immediately reduced after injury and can remain low for up to 4 days. Decreased magnesium levels may lead to a neuronal dysfunction via multiple mechanisms, including decreased energy production, dysregulation of the cellular membrane, and decreased protein synthesis. Finally, low levels of magnesiums may effectively unblock the NMDA receptor channel more easily, thus leading to a greater influx of calcium and furthering mitochondrial dysfunction and oxidative stress. Other effects include those of the blood-brain barrier. BBB surrounds blood vessels in the brain and protects against circulating toxins or pathogens that could enter the brain and cause brain injury. Physical and chemical damage can cause an increase in the permeability or the leakiness in the protective BBB, meaning toxic compounds can gain access to the brain where they normally would not be able to, and this can contribute to a pathological environment which further causes harm to the brain. Other effects include those of blood flow changes. Under normal conditions, cerebral blood flow is tightly coupled to neuronal activity and glucose metabolism within the brain. Some studies have shown that this blood flow may be reduced by up to 50% of normal, resulting in a mismatch in supply and demand, and ultimately potentially worsening the damaging energy crisis that occurs in a concussion syndrome.
Further injury can occur and is known as a syndrome called second impact syndrome. This is where a person receives another head injury before they are fully recovered from an initial concussion. This syndrome is quite rare but is important as it can be fatal. This normally occurs in teenagers and young adults. Now, while the exact mechanism of second impact syndrome is not completely known, it's thought that it is due to a loss of the autoregulation of the cerebral vasculature, which leads to increased brain swelling, raised intracranial pressure, and ultimately herniation of the brain, leading to death. Whilst it is rare, it is serious. Repeated head injury can result in a condition known as chronic traumatic encephalopathy. This is quite common in boxers and people that sustain multiple head injuries over a lifetime. An accumulation of these head injuries can result in chronic changes. Features include dementia, personality changes, emotional changes, and even movement disorders.
So how do we prevent concussions and knockouts from happening? The most important rule is to protect yourself at all times. Whether you're brushing your teeth at home, relaxing on the couch, watching television, or importantly, even in bed, going to sleep. It's crucial that you always protect yourself no matter what you're doing, and make sure that nothing even comes close to touching your head. Nah, I'm just joking. Prevention is broken up into primary, secondary, and tertiary. Primary prevention aims to avoid concussions from happening in the first place. This includes head protection during sports and exercise where you're at risk of injuring your head, and rules such as no high tackling to prevent head injury. Secondary and tertiary prevention center around recognizing concussion and implementing strategies to prevent subsequent concussions from occurring to ultimately protect against the damaging effect and potential long-term consequences that concussions can have.
So hopefully you now have more of an idea of what happens in a concussion and a knockout. Let me know in the comments if this has ever happened to you. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.